we have hosted for, I think, 6, maybe 7 years here in Cedar Rapids. We have an identical type program in Des Moines. And really, Intersections is about civil dialogue on issues that impact each of us in our communities. And so we're very pleased to be here and to lead this effort and conversation. Before I go any further, are these keys anyone in the room? They have a Y? Ah, very good. Way to go. You would have figured it out when you tried to leave, but anyway. So thank you for being here, and I want to thank our caterer. She's new to us this year, and she's done a phenomenal job, Heidi, who's hiding in the kitchen. And we're very pleased to support small businesses in the Cedar Rapids area. We love being able to do that wherever we are, so thank you to her. We have, I don't know, something important coming up in the next week. And hopefully at least half of you have already voted and the other half are voting by next Tuesday. So we are nonpartisan and we don't endorse any candidates, but we do encourage people to vote. And so hopefully in this room, you all are very engaged citizens. I know that you are, and would encourage you to take advantage of that in our great democracy. Before I also forget, next month, December 7th, we will be back here for Intersections, and we are hosting Professor, hey Robin, would you turn that light back on that you turned off? There's a switch there. Yeah, oh, nope, the other way. Okay. We have Professor Jennifer Harvey from Drake University, so she'll be writing here with Kristen and me, and she's going to talk about white privilege and just a variety of issues around that. And she is a phenomenal person and presenter, and you will want to be here. She's a good friend, and I'm just pleased that we're able to have her here in Cedar Rapids, so you will want to be back for that. For Intersections, we love to have your reservations, and we know we have enough food primarily and have enough chairs around, so make sure that you do send in your reservations to Kristen either by email or phone. So it's always very helpful. And without further ado, let me introduce you to Peter Jauhiainen. Nope, that's not Jauhiainen. See, I practiced it all week. Literally practiced it all week, didn't I, Kristen? Peter Jauhiainen, is that better?
About 93%.
Okay. I'm just going to let you say it.
All right.
Okay. Who is the professor of religion at Kirkwood Community College, who specializes in American religious history. One of his current research interests is the intersection of religion and politics in contemporary American life and its impact on public education. And he's here to talk to us about the Christian rights assault on public education. Will you help me welcome Peter, please?
Thank you, Connie. Can you hear me okay? All right. So it's Jauhiainen, in case you want to know. Good Finnish name, by way of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and Duluth, Minnesota, and all the way down. All right. One little caveat to begin with. I am an American religious historian. I'm not a historian of education. I'm not a professor of education. So I'm not an expert on educational policy. I'm not an expert on what to do to fix the public schools if they need fixing. I'm a religious historian. So I'm interested in how religious ideas and movements and part of the culture intersect with issues related to American religion, and here my focal point is on public education. So without further ado here, I want to start with, go back to the 1950s. And I want to talk about different layers that go into this assault on, the modern day assault on the public schools. And I think one layer we need to consider is an important Supreme Court decision in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education, in which the Supreme Court basically ruled that separate but equal is rarely or never equal. This was a reversal of a previous Supreme Court decision in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, which helped to set up Jim Crow in the South and so forth, right? And so the Supreme Court intervened and said that this was unconstitutional. Oh, all right, yeah. So we had a young girl who, I can't see this, okay, yeah. Who in Topeka, Kansas, and 8-year-old Linda Brown had to walk 2 miles in order to go to a black school, right? Because she was prohibited from going to the white school, as it were, right? And so this was a major decision. Now, in the South, one of the reactions to this was that many of the states simply closed a lot of their public schools. In the South, they started setting up these private segregation academies, and they sprang up all over the place in the old Confederate states. And one of the tools that they used then to fund these schools was to use school vouchers, right? Where the state tax dollars would go to the student and they could apply it to these segregation academies. And so during this time, a lot of conservative critics of this decision resented this kind of federal intrusion. Okay, yeah, Brown versus Board of Education, right? So the Brown versus Board of Education, mandated the integration of the public schools, and I just lost. Okay, all right, good. Okay, now I'm aware. So a lot of Southern Christians, a lot of Southern conservatives resented this federal intrusion, right, into their schools, into their way of life, and so forth. Jump ahead another 10 years. Another significant event for our purposes here was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And again, a lot of Southern fundamentalists saw it as a threat to the right of private institutions to exclude anyone they wish, right? And so you begin to see, a lot of opposition against the state, the federal state, and their intrusion to this Southern way of life. A lot of Southern conservatives attacked this, believed that this act was an attack on American values, the right of free association, right? One such school, which would come up later on, Bob Jones University, was a fundamentalist university in South Carolina that excluded African Americans from enrolling in the school. Bob Jones prohibited, didn't believe in interracial marriage, interracial dating, and so Bob Jones, the head of Bob Jones University, announced that he would refuse to admit African Americans into the school. Right. And we also part of the 1960s, we have the sexual revolution. I can actually talk to an audience that remembers this, right? My students are like, what? What are you talking about, right? There's sweeping cultural transformations that were taking place here. You like my little, Sex and the Single Girl, right? And sexual attitudes started changing almost overnight. What did I put in there? Okay. Regarding the public schools, in 1964, we see the rise of the first comprehensive sex education curriculum established by SECUS, the Sexual Information and Education Council of the United States. So they produced the first comprehensive, kind of evidence-based sex education program. And by 1968, nearly half of the public schools, had some sort of sex education program. Right. Now, social conservatives objected to this because sex education was taught from a more scientific perspective. It was taught from a kind of amoral, non-religious perspective. And they thought that no, sex education should be something that was taught within the church, within the home, and so forth. So they began this campaign against the introduction of sex education in the public schools. And that became a very, kind of the heart of this was in Anaheim, California. It spread out throughout the rest of the nation. At the heart of this, then, it really became kind of a rallying point for a lot of fundamentalist Christians, a lot of conservative fundamentalist Protestants, conservative Catholics, a lot of right-wing organizations, conservative Republican legislators who kind of started forming this coalition to campaign against sex education. I got some juicy quotes here. Billy James Hargis from the Christian Crusade said that Sikhism was the pornographic arm of liberal education. It was all part of a giant communist conspiracy. Hargis claimed that sex ed was part of a larger plan hatched by progressive educators, and I quote, to destroy the traditional moral fiber of America and replace it with a pervasive, sickly humanism. Right. So, I'll return to that subject of humanism in a bit. And so, I'm old enough to remember the 60s. I'm not old enough to have really experienced the 60s, but some of you are. But I grew up a half block away from a college campus, and as a child, I was born in 1960, and by the late 60s, oh, this is interesting. What's going on, right? A lot of attitudes, traditional attitudes, had changed. Right? So you see polling data even about premarital sex, for example. This was a revolution. In 1969, 24% said premarital sex was okay. By 1982, even by 1973, that number had doubled. Right? By 1982, 62% had agreed. Right? There was just a huge transformation in the culture during this time. Right? So conservatives warned of these kinds of changes that were seeping into the public schools. They warned of other signs of secularization in the public schools. So in 1962, the Supreme Court outlawed an official prayer that had been composed by the New York Board of Regents. In 1963, they followed up with striking down devotional Bible reading and the recitation of the Lord's Prayer. By 1980, they struck down the required posting of the Ten Commandments in Kentucky classrooms and so forth. Another kind of lightning rod during this period was the book by the philosopher Joseph Fletcher, who published his Situation Ethics, in which he argued for a kind of situational theory of ethics, that there are no moral absolutes, as it were. So for the next 2 decades, a lot of fundamentalists started complaining that public schools were simply propagating his philosophy in so-called values clarification discussions. You begin to see a change in public education at this time. A lot of educators, rather than simply, you see this in social studies curricula, anthropological curricula, and so forth, rather than simply imposing upon students a kind of Judeo-Christian moral ethic, right? They begin to encourage students to think for themselves, right? Offering up a variety of different possibilities, right? And getting them to clarify their own values, right? So a lot of Christian conservatives objected to this because you're divorcing it from the family instruction, right, that they wanted to have provided, right? So this became a huge point of contention at the time. So a lot of Christian conservatives are beginning to argue that the public schools are undermining God's standards, right? Their own particular Christian viewpoint here. Mel and Norma Gabler became very popular in a lot of fundamentalist and evangelical circles. They mounted a nationwide campaign against the textbook industry in the 1960s and the 1970s. They complained about an alleged liberal bias in high school history books, in economics books, in biology textbooks. This is coming at a time in which, like history programs are beginning to offer alternative viewpoints. They're beginning to question some of the kind of standard normative kind of a Christian vision of American history and so forth, America on the side of God and all that. Evolution being incorporated into science curricula and so forth, right? And they had a very extensive network, the Gablers. By 1981, their home-based organization had a mailing list of over 12,000 members, right? And they were becoming an important force in very conservative circles. By the late 1970s, conservative Christians charged that the public schools were teaching an alternative belief and value system that undermined Christianity. Many leaders began to use the term secular humanism in order to encapsulate what was going on in the public schools. And again, to a certain degree, they were correct. The schools were changing, right? The schools, a lot of educators were far more open to civil rights leaders, civil rights opinions. They were a lot more open to feminist perspectives, women's rights, right? And they started encouraging students to explore these things more. A lot of educators began to encourage students to think for themselves, and they became a lot more open to cultural diversity. So students now in English classes might have to read literary texts from the Chicano tradition or Black Power movement or feminist texts or other kinds of texts that were representative of American cultural diversity, right? So in the 70s, as the schools begin to incorporate more viewpoints that, minority voices that had been shut out of the curriculum, right? For generations, right? A lot of fundamentalists, a lot of conservative Christians saw this as an attack on Christianity. Well, yeah, there was a greater openness to these diverse perspectives, right? And so they called this secular humanism. The charge was that they were kind of foisting a kind of secular perspective on people, all right? When I would argue that the schools were just becoming more neutral spaces in which a variety of alternative viewpoints were being presented. Viewpoints that had been previously shut out, right? And you begin to see more and more of the curriculum begin to challenge traditional gender roles. So yes, if your view of the schools was of a kind of white patriarchal Christian viewpoint, yeah, the schools were changing, right? You would feel attacked, right? These assumptions were being attacked. A leading thinker for a lot of evangelicals was a man by the name of Francis Schaeffer. I was in college in the early 80s and so forth. I remember his works. He wrote a text and he published a series of films, 1976, How Should We Then Live? In which he argued that a Christian's basic intellectual assumptions differed radically from those of contemporary society, and he labeled this as secular humanism, that secular humanism was this kind of atheistic system that was being foisted upon people. And according to Francis Schaeffer, in this system there is no absolute moral standard of truth. God's moral standards are being replaced by arbitrary standards. According to Schaeffer, this is going to lead to moral decline. It's going to lead to all sorts of problems within society. And so one of the key points of his books and his movies was that the Christians need to be engaged in the culture. They need to be engaged in politics to turn back the tide of secular humanism. Conservative Christians must infiltrate our cultural institutions that are being infested with this religion of humanism, as it were. He followed up with a documentary series, How Should We Then Live? This became This is a video series. This became a sensation among evangelicals, among a lot of conservative Christians. It was shown all over the country. People would come out to movie theaters en masse and watch this series. How many of you have heard of this series before? See, it's hardly a blip. In evangelical circles, if I were, the hands would be almost unanimous, probably, in the older generation. Schaeffer is significant in that, how many of you even heard of Francis Schaeffer's name before this day? Right? See, he is one of the most significant figures within evangelical circles in the last 50 years. He's right up there with Billy Graham, right? He gave conservative evangelicals a framework for understanding the secular drift of the country. And the country was becoming more secularized. But he provided a framework for them to kind of, with this kind of bogeyman, secular humanism, for dealing with some of these larger cultural trends. And so he was really a key person in transforming a lot of modern day evangelicals into the kind of culture warriors that emerged by the time of Ronald Reagan and thereafter, right? That has led to a lot of divisiveness to this very day. I could cite other texts. I mean, Annalee McGraw wrote a pamphlet called Secular Humanism in the Schools, the issue whose time has come. Basically, she was arguing, you see this kind of argument in a lot of conservative circles, that a humanistic education is undermining moral values, family values, Christian values. It encourages children to create their own systems of morality. And she argued that this represented an assault on the First Amendment and on Christianity, a violation of the prohibition against government interference in religion. Obviously, she wanted a certain kind of religion to be a kind of a core element of the public schools, and a lot of people in these circles would argue that what's being substituted for Christianity is simply this religion of humanism. And I'll address that later on. I think it's a logical, there's a logical fallacy there, but I'll address that maybe later on. So as a result of this, a lot of Christian conservatives started their own began to start their own private schools. By the late 1970s, there were at least 5,000 non-Catholic Christian schools in the United States. From 1965 to 1975, enrollment in Christian schools grew by 202%. By 1979, there were more than 100 million students enrolled in these schools. Right? More than what did I say? Oh, more than 1 million, yeah, that's a little bit more significant than, right? Yeah, at one point there were something like 2 private Christian schools opening every day. It was like this massive exodus from the public schools, which has all sorts of repercussions then for support for the public schools, right? And draining resources from the public schools, right?
How much was that attributed in the South, though, to desegregation?
Well, that's one layer, right? And some of these schools, right, started out as segregation academies, right? So in the South, you had the layer of segregation, racism, right? They wanted whites-only schools. Now, by the 70s, you add this layer of the culture war, right? And so by that time, a lot of these schools that were opening up, some of them might have had a kind of segregationist mentality to them, but you see a lot of these fundamentalist leaders who are decrying the secularization of the public schools. They're concerned about sex education. They're concerned about the lack of prayer in the schools just as much as I don't want my kids to associate with black people, right? So there's a mix. There's a mix there. But the foundation had been these segregationist academies, and then you begin to see real concerns among people on the religious right about the nature of the public schools themselves, right? Thus, you begin to see the rise of a new political movement, often called the New Christian Right, the New Religious Right, in which evangelicals began to cooperate with Jews and Catholics, other non-evangelical groups who shared some of their principles, right? In the past, boy, evangelicals and Catholics would not have gotten along, would not have cooperated on any kind of social or political agenda. Now they began to find some common ground with them. And so they became leaders of a comprehensive political movement associated with a partisan cause, right? So you see the rise of the New Religious Right. Now there's a mythology out there that says that the religious right, how am I doing for time? Ooh, okay, I got 5 minutes. There's a mythology that says it was all about abortion. Abortion became a later issue that was layered on to kind of mobilize people. The catalyst really was a decision by the IRS to intervene in a lot of these segregationist academies to revoke their tax-exempt status. Because under IRS rulings, they no longer qualified as charitable organizations, right? So I'm gonna flip ahead, and so you have Jerry Falwell and the rise of the moral majority. Complaint. Pat Robertson, the Christian Coalition in the 1990s, brought a lot of Pentecostals and charismatics into the fold of the New Religious Right. It was by the 1990s that their platform really merges quite well with the kind of the conservative Republican platform. The Christian right, the New Religious Right, was almost synonymous with the Republican Party by this time. I know you're nonpartisan, but I'm just stating the facts here. And by the 1990s, then, prominent reformers begin to target the very notion of public education. Here's where you begin to see the convergence of different groups that are coming together to undermine public education. State governments started adopting charter school legislation in the name of promoting innovation, but often as a way to enable public funding of religious schools. A lot of schools in a lot of states, they were religious schools, just became public charter schools, and they've hardly changed their curriculum at all, right? It just became a way for them to receive public funding. And there were coalitions of inner city African Americans, anti-public libertarian reformers, conservative Catholics, right? They had their own parochial school system and they would love additional funding, right? Who demanded vouchers as the solution to a low quality schooling, right? So vouchers becomes a kind of handiwork for taking resources, all these public dollars, and applying them to the private sector. Increasing numbers of families started homeschooling, reaching 1.5 million children in 2007. Iowa, in about 2013, kind of laxed its oversight of the homeschooling, right? So that's another issue here in the state of Iowa. I have a whole series of questions to raise of some of these issues. One issue is, what about the regulation? What about the oversight of some of these private schools or homeschoolers if increasingly public dollars are being applied to their programs, right? Should there be some sort of, it's a big issue for me. If you ever want a very helpful book in sorting through some of these issues, for me, is a book by Benjamin Justice and Colin McLeod, Have a Little Faith, Religion, Democracy in the American Public School, University of Chicago Press, 2016. This is, I think, a philosopher and a historian that come together, have some very interesting insights and questions about what's going on here. I've got maybe a minute. One of my critiques, one of my concerns as more and more, say, members of the Republican Party, but even some Democrats advocate for increased school choice, is, as an alternative to public schooling, one of my concerns is the narrow sectarian character of a lot of these private schools, right? What kind of education are students getting, And should public dollars be applied to narrow sectarian schooling? You know, what if you have a school that is teaching anti-democratic principles? What if you have a school that is teaching hatred of Muslims and hatred of homosexuals and hatred, right? There are plenty of schools out there. Should we be applying public dollars to such schools that might even offer very anti-democratic messages, right? Let alone having a very narrow curriculum, not properly preparing their students for kind of public democracy. I have other questions that I'd like to raise, but I'm gonna open this up, I think, to maybe I can cover some of these as you have your questions. So,
If you'll raise your hand, and I will bring the microphone to you. I'm going to head over to the other side of the room and just catch my eye, and I kind of keep track of who has questions.
It was interesting to me that Time magazine in the last month, I believe, had an article about the subject matter of history in the homeschooling curriculum, saying that it was teaching the fact that this country was settled for whites under God's direction, and that was in their curriculum that they're teaching. Why it appears in so much of our public thought, that idea.
So are you asking why does that appear?
Well, I'm just saying that Time magazine had an article on that.
Yeah, and I would argue then in a narrow curriculum like that, that obviously is being taught from a particular historical bias, that public dollars should not be going to support that kind of curriculum, right? I mean, it doesn't represent the diverse nation that we are, and so that would be one argument against. Yeah, there's a certain kind of Christian dominionist kind of history that is taught in a lot of these private schools and homeschoolers. You know, that America's a chosen nation and so forth, and it's not a kind of credible version of history according to the academy. Yep.
Well, kind of piggybacking on that comment, could you, maybe this is kind of a narrow interest of mine, but could you elaborate on, you mentioned Schaeffer and his huge influence on the emergence of the Christian right in the 70s and 80s, but could you elaborate maybe a little bit on Rushdoony? I always thought of him as kind of a fringe figure, but it sounds like there were some real connections there between Rushdoony and Schaeffer, and you know, from what I've seen, I'm a minister, and I know a lot of parents who homeschool, and I've looked over the curriculum. A lot of it's from Bob Jones, a lot of it from Pensacola Christian, and it's right out of that kind of Christian dominionist, Reconstructionist framework. So I'm kind of curious if Rushdoony is more of a mainstream figure among some of these circles than I had anticipated, than I thought.
Yeah,
So anyway.
I don't know a ton about Rushdoony. I've always seen him not as significant a figure as some of the others, like Schaeffer. He's someone who has perpetuated this kind of Christian view of American history and dominionist view. I think this view is increasingly becoming more commonplace among conservative Republicans, partly due to the efforts of David Barton, who's not a trained historian, but has a whole cottage industry of perpetuating a kind of Christian view of America. So I wouldn't be surprised if Rushdoony, and he's not even alive now, is there? But I mean, has had a big influence on people like Barton and others. I mean, it was a Newt Gingrich who talked about David Barton being a kind of treasure, one of the great historians, or something to that effect. And most historians, trained historians, would raise their eyebrows at least. But so, yep.
Hi, Peter. Here we've got what seems to, I think, everyone or virtually in this room, a reasonable position that the public education system should support, if not advance, the interests of a civil democratic society. It proceeds from that assumption back to and even before Jefferson. But the private schoolers, the homeschoolers based on a religious conservatism, don't share that fundamental assumption. How do we even communicate with each other? How do we come to any kind of rapprochement or civil dialogue about this issue if we proceed from fundamentally different assumptions?
If you have an answer to that question, please tell me. I mean, what you're dealing with is increasing segments of the population. It's one thing it's easier to dialogue maybe with, say, Catholic leaders, right? And they have a long-standing tradition of parochial schools. But my concern here has been with this extreme right wing who perceives what I would call the secularization of the schools. There's a difference between teaching a religion of secularism, right? And having a gradual secularization process that allows for diverse voices and anyone from any tradition. It can be a variety of different religious traditions or non-religious, right? Any non-religious people to feel equally included in our public schools. I think that's a basic foundation of our public schools, to teach students how to be good American citizens. And if we are to have a healthy democracy, that might include being exposed to diverse viewpoints, right? Feminist viewpoints, viewpoints from, black history, viewpoints from homosexual, viewpoints from, evolutionary. That's part of being part of this civil discourse within our society. What you have now is a certain chunk, a certain base within a particular political party that sees this as the work of Satan, right? I mean, so how do you, no, I don't know how to dialogue. I can at least lay out, I can try to counter arguments by saying, well, no, it's not humanism. I've heard Iowa State legislators talk about humanism in the public schools. I've seen that, it's like, no, they're secular spaces to allow for a flourishing of different voices, right? It doesn't mean that a Christian viewpoint is necessarily being denigrated, right? It's just that it's just one of multiple voices, right? But if you've been used to this privileged, white, patriarchal Christian privilege, right? Then when that is dismantled, then you feel persecuted, right? So I think a lot of people from this constituency feel like they've lost the battle over the public schools. So then their next effort is to try to bleed the resources from the public schools. And now they've got a champion in the Department of Education in the name of Betsy DeVos, right? Her goal is to privatize, and there's all sorts of think tanks, and you've got ALEC, and you've got the Walton Foundation, and all these other, the Koch brothers. They would like to bleed resources from the public schools because they've lost on this front. The schools have become too accepting, right? They've become too secularized. So, okay, we're gonna live in our isolated communities here, in our isolated educational communities, and we're gonna try to take back the culture that way. But how to dialogue with them, I don't know. That's a hard one.
I grew up as a fundamentalist Christian and went to Christian school my whole life. So I'm very familiar with all of these names, very influential in my life growing up. What's interesting is the school, for instance, that I went to, K through 12th, is no longer in existence. And it seems like that trend is kind of, I see that, it seems like, throughout the nation. So is it true that, a lot of private Christian schools, especially fundamentalist evangelical type Christian schools, have kind of fallen off as far as their enrollment, and you hear about them closing down, so on and so forth? Do you think there's a strategy, kind of a shift in the strategy to, I know you kind of touched on this a little bit, but to kind of Christianize the public school system now that there is, fewer private Christian schools out there? It seems to me that there seems to be a little bit of that going on within the public school system. But I don't know if you
I'm
have
not
any
aware of
comments
an
on that.
extensive strategy to try to Christianize the public school system. I see more of a strategy of trying to get public dollars and redirect them to the private schools. Now, to what degree are private schools shutting down? I mean, you see these charter schools popping up all the time, and a lot of the charter schools in a lot of states are basically Christian schools, right? And I saw some stats, something like, the estimate is like 90% of the Christian private schools are set up by conservative evangelicals, right?
So is there a rise in Christian public schools in the United States?
I don't know if there's a
What's the
recent
trend?
rise. I mean, the trend line had been a pretty significant rise. Maybe it's tabled off for a while, but now the new strategy is to maybe open up charter schools or have kind of, or even now for-profit charter schools. I see stories almost weekly of charter schools shutting down their doors, and the CEO of it making off with lots of money, or then what happens to those students, right? Well, then do they go back to the public schools? The public schools have to educate everyone, right? So you see a lot of businesses who are trying to promote charter schools as a way to get into some of those public dollars, right?
We've been kind of talking in the bigger, larger, maybe national view on this. Where are things here in our local communities? How much of this stuff is happening directly in our schools? Because that's where we have a strong voice. We can vote for school boards, we can attend school board meetings, we can push back if we know what's going on.
Well, here locally, I mean, we do have a charter school, but it's under the supervision of the school board here, right? Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and so Iowa has a lot more stringent requirements on I think there's like 3 charter schools in the state of Iowa, something like that.
No, there's only, or correct me if I'm wrong, there's only 3 charter schools. We have a max cap of, I think, 10.
Yeah.
But they do have to be connected to public schools. We don't have
Yeah.
the option to have private, we don't have the option to have for-profit charters in Iowa,
Yeah.
so.
But there's been a push in certain
Absolutely.
legislators.
And there's been legislation, absolutely. We
Yeah.
fight that every day.
Yeah, and so you do have, in Iowa at least, and locally, it's under a democratically elected school board, right? In other states, that's not the case. And so you've got people who will move in, change a Christian school into a charter school, get a lot of money from the state coifers, and then they might shut it down, and there's no accountability, right? Or at least, we could get into the whole issue of the philosophy behind charter schools from the very beginning, but at least it's under I would say, if we're going to have charters, we have to have them under the control of local school boards. There has to be some sort of accountability, right?
Question. You talk a lot about morality in the schools and the concern about that. What about science? What are the charter schools, the Christian schools doing in regard to science, climate change, evolution, Adam and Eve and the dinosaurs and so on?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. A lot of them don't teach evolutionary perspectives. They don't teach climate change, right? They teach a kind of biblical mandate to subdue the earth and utilize the earth's resources. So, yeah, there's a kind of narrow education that's being propounded in a lot of these more fundamentalist schools, right? So, again, we have a whole generation of children that are being raised in some of these schools that then, when scientists are almost universal in their consensus about global warming, they believe it's just simply a hoax, right? Or they think it's an ideology.
Yeah, Peter, I wonder if you could put in historical context that Christians in North America were leaders in establishing schools, and that those eventually were taken over by public entities, and that we still have a vestigial remain of Sunday schools that were instrumental in breaking the death grip of industrialists over child labor. So that some elements of the Christian church are now taking retrograde positions I wonder if you could speak a little bit to how that transition happened in historical context.
Well, yeah, I mean, in the 19th century with the rise of the public schools, they were basically controlled by a lot of Protestant leaders, right? And so one of the tensions in the 19th century was you had a lot of Catholics who objected to a kind of generic Protestant curriculum, right? It used to include Protestant religious exercises and prayers and slanders against Catholics and Jews and so forth. And so the Catholics started setting up their own parochial school system. You know, the idea was for, you know, the public schools in the 19th century really served as a kind of substitute for the lack of a national religion, right? So we had the First Amendment, a disestablishment of religion, and yet the public schools became a kind of substitute, right? There was a kind of implicit establishment of religion here, whereby you make good American citizens, i.e. Protestant American citizens, right? That begins to change in the late 19th century, early 20th century, the demands of industrialization. You have certain thinkers like John Dewey and others with the Columbia Teachers College who begin to advocate for a more advanced education, specialization in certain subdisciplines to meet the demands of an industrialized capitalistic society, right? So the schools become a lot more secularized as you go through the 20th century, but many of them still contained a lot of these religious exercises, right? Not all of them, not all states. I don't remember, I grew up in Duluth, Minnesota in the 1960s. We never had prayers in the school, but some of the schools still did, right? And so what you get is, as increasingly some of these religious elements from the old Protestant establishment get dismantled, get removed, then I think it triggers the backlash, right? So you've lost your privileged position in the schools. And the public schools then have done a better job of becoming more secularized. They become more liberal in that sense, in the broad sense of being open to all these diverse perspectives, right? Which, you know, Christian fundamentalists are going to see as an attack on their values. It's an attack on Christianity, that the public schools themselves represent an assault on what they think made America great. Right.
Right here.
Yes.
It seems that this view of education is an outworking of the religious views of conservative Protestants, right, evangelicals. And so I wonder if, as a religious historian, if you have maybe comment about when we were talking about dialoguing between, it seems like that is a religious tradition that's rooted in an exclusive mentality, going back to the Reformation, or I mean, maybe it's always been that way, I guess. So maybe there's something to be said about the exclusivity promoted by the religious leaders who are behind the schools to begin with.
I'm not clear on the question.
Okay,
so
is there, I guess I'm looking to see if the exclusive worldview of Protestants, these evangelicals, is that really what is working out into the education systems that they're propounding? So those Christian schools, those that the attack of the Christian right on school is really just an outworking of the religious view, their view of God, the Bible, those things worked out into practical view. So would it be fair to say that the only way to dialogue would to be actually going to the religious basis behind it, the interpretation of the Bible, their view of God, that sort of thing?
Well, I wouldn't want a dialogue to try to undermine their religious viewpoint, right? They're allowed, if someone is a religious exclusivist, you have every right under the First Amendment, you have every right to be a theological exclusivist, right? So I wouldn't want to try to undermine their religious faith. And they have the right to establish their own schools, right? But in recent decades, our schools have become more inclusive, right? They become less exclusive. So my big point is, yeah, you have the right to establish your schools. You don't necessarily have the right to have the public dollars go to those schools that are going to be teaching exclusive viewpoints that marginalize your fellow Americans, right? So you have the right to your religious exclusivity, but we have the right to say, okay, but you got to pay your own tuition and not have public dollars go to support what some might regard as a reactionary viewpoint or something. Right?
And I think my point is close to what he was talking about here. I'm afraid that the problem is a matter of priorities of the culture. Some cultures really value the best for everybody. Other cultures, like ours, value individualism, getting ahead by hard work, and that you earn everything that you have, and therefore it's yours and you shouldn't have to share it. If you get a society like in Scandinavia, where you get a more egalitarian system, there isn't any question about everybody's going to have a good school and we'll pay for it because that's what we value. We have a good health system there because that's what they value. That's not the case here. The UN has two conventions, one on political and civil rights, which the U.S. thoroughly endorses, one on economic, social, and cultural rights, which the U.S. has never ratified, but the socialist world has ratified. So one thing that the poor countries of the socialist world, Vietnam, China, the USSR, have done is everybody had access to a decent education and health care. They might not have had wealth and freedom of expression and some of the things that we value here. But I think it's a matter of Americans need to sort out what their priorities are. And if our priorities are that everybody have a right to dignity of all kinds, it's going to be expensive, but then we can have that kind of society. If we really want to do everybody for himself, that's what we've got.
Well, you make an interesting point, because I think increasingly, we used to think of education primarily as a public good, right? To promote public citizenship, democracy, and with that specialization, with industrialization, you begin to see a lot of that factoring in as well. Now, increasingly, among these so-called education reformers and people who want to have vouchers and education savings accounts and so forth, now increasingly they're seeing education as a private good, right? And so you see a shift in the mentality, so let the dollars follow the student. Well, what about this larger common good? What about this public good, right? And how does public education contribute to that? I think that's an important part of that dialogue, rather than simply seeing education as a private good that you can apply to whatever school you want to go.
Are there limits here in Iowa on what schools are eligible for the school tuition organization funds?
What schools are eligible? There are folks here who would be able to answer that question better than me.
I don't.
I think Art State might be able to answer that question better.
Actually, no. The family decides that. They apply for it, and they have to give it to that individual school, though. But as long as it's a certified or even non-certified school in the state of Iowa, they can do that.
Yep. Again, it gets back to that whole issue of oversight of what's being taught in some of these schools, right?
I just wanted to thank the Interfaith Alliance for presenting this program and other programs. I think it's been extremely important for all of us to hear what you have to say, and previous speakers also.
I'm traveling across the room. Not quite done yet.
The thing that I'm concerned about more is the homeschooling, because I don't know how to have a conversation exactly, but I have once. I worked with a colleague that homeschooled her own children, and we would talk on our own time about it. And the thing that and it was here in Cedar Rapids, and the thing that she is really adamant about is that she should have her tax dollars for her kids at her homeschool. And she said, but how she always would word it is, it's her right. I have a right to that money. And why should I pay? Why should my tax dollars go to other people's children? And I just explained to her that I didn't have any children in public school, and I was all for public money going to schools. You know, I don't need a firefighter today, but I love paying taxes for firefighters. Everything else went down the gamut. But I kind of think there is a really strong web, I think, of homeschoolers. She was saying, well, the kind of support system throughout Iowa and beyond the borders of Iowa, they all talk and they're all together and they help each other. But it's not the private schools so much as, even for me, as I'm frustrated with homeschoolers that want to drain tax dollars from public good. And I just think that they don't believe in the public good in that area.
Yeah, I guess I would respond to her that taxes are part of the cost of participating in civil society, right? You know, so.
Just wanted to comment, Representative Art State here from Cedar Rapids, a comment on the extent and of this movement that you're talking about. Right now, last year, year before, and this year during the summertime, the Cook Brothers, Jeb Bush, Betsy Voss, other groups, Americans for Prosperity, others have put together this huge national conference where they pay legislators' way for 3 to 5 days. You go to great resorts out in Colorado, whatever. So they pay all your expenses, and they talk about how you can do this, how as a legislator, you know, what the bills you could pass, what the legislation is, why that's important that individuals not have to pay taxes to public schools if they want to send their kids to Christian academies. They give the legislators talking points, how to do the argument and help. They actually have sent a person here in Iowa who works with legislators, a lobbyist, to do that for this purpose, to make sure they can do that. We know in the last legislative session, Walt Rogers and others who were at these conventions and so on moved legislation, trying to get that passed this last year, and just by a hair were stopped in the very last days of the legislature. But I want you to know this is a huge national movement. I wanted to find out about it, so I accepted their invitation last year, went expense-free, and we had about 6 to 10 Iowa legislators there from a party. They wanted to know why I was there. I told them I wanted to find out what this was all about, and I did, and it was a propaganda. Thank you.
Terry Branstad was a founding member of ALEC, the Koch-backed organization. Linda Upmeyer, Speaker of the House, is a prominent member. I mean, there are other, you know, so yeah, this is a huge corporate entity trying to undermine. Education savings account is kind of the new, you know, Iowans have, according to polling data, Iowans have roundly rejected the concept of vouchers, but educational savings accounts now becomes one of those new ways of getting at this, right? And expanding the 529s, yeah. So, yes.
Yeah, Peter, I wonder if you could comment on the tie-in of kind of the neoliberal political economy, kind of overlaying the culture war that then overlaid the segregationist academies, and then if you can talk a little bit about how would we find a philosophical or some basis for the public good or common good to reemerge as a central factor in our country's life.
So unpack for me what you mean by neoliberal political economy. Let's say
belief in the marketplace.
Yeah, okay.
As the way to resolve issues.
And so the market then is private schools, homeschooling, charter schools, and then a declamation against monopolies, especially state-run monopolies, and smaller government, fewer taxes, and so on. All kind of overlays, not not just the Republicans, but a large number of Democrats embrace this too. Financialization of the economy, and so on.
Yeah, I guess I would just say there's a synthesis, right? In some sectors, segregation becomes very important. Then you have the overlay of the culture wars, right? The reaction against the secularization of the public schools. But then by the 1990s, you see a diverse coalition of different groups. You might have African Americans in urban areas combining with neoliberal Democrats and neoliberal Republicans who think that the free marketplace is the way to go, that that's going to solve all of our problems. When you, I don't know where to go with this. You're dealing with children, right? You're dealing with the education of children, and you're trying to provide marketplace solutions to education. In the free marketplace, you have businesses that fail all the time, right? And you have businesses that close all the time. So are we going to set up our schools as a kind of another free market enterprise in which I could send my kids to a school for 6 months and all of a sudden, oh, we're not doing it, we're going to shut down. Now what do I do? Right? Is this what we want? Or do we need to have some sort of public investment, right? Because, you know, these charter schools that shut down, they can just, well, okay, or they can have stringent demands on their kids, and if you don't meet up with their requirements, out you go, right? Well, the public schools can't do that, right? So this complete kind of free marketplace solution to what might ail some public schools is you don't fix the public schools by removing them, right? By destroying them, right? So I'm concerned by the convergence of some of that neoliberal thinking with, right? They're finding common cause and they're finding, right, people to coalesce around. And we're seeing this very pervasive, and it's funded by a lot of corporate money as well. Huge amounts of corporate money. Yes.
Can you ask him about your...
Peter, I don't understand how corporate America, the corporate America that's involved in this, sees this as being an advantage into the future when you come from a pluralistic society to, I don't get it. I can't see their thinking.
Short term. Money.
Short term, and there's a lot of money. There's a lot of money to be made by having access to public dollars and setting up. One of these organizations, was it the K-12 Inc. or something? It was set up by a hedge fund manager. I mean, think of the millions of dollars that people want access to, right?
But in terms of educating a public that will be productive in a pluralistic society, somewhere the return, I would think it would be counterproductive.
Well, there are a lot of studies that have shown that the charter schools in various states aren't doing very well. Michigan is a miserable failure, and that's a state where Betsy DeVos has had a huge degree of influence. There was a study done, was Louisiana and Indiana, and I feel, you know, and on some charter schools do well, others do very poorly. So, yeah, some of those charter schools that are more selective, obviously their test scores are going to be better. Right?
Help me to thank Peter. Thank you so much. One of the best things that you can do if you are concerned about this and concerned about our public education is to be involved in the process, the legislative process, and to put your voice out there. Interfaith Alliance this is one of the issues that is square in the middle of what we do, and protecting public schools, public education, and making sure that our public dollars are used for our public use. And so if you are not on our email list, would encourage you to do that. There's forms that Kristen has. I know there's a number of new people here today. We send out an email on Tuesdays. That's general information during the legislative year. Session, we send out an email on Fridays that has all of the issues that we work on and all the legislation that we work on. And so you can be very much engaged in talking with your good legislators. You don't have to worry about art, but others you might. So we would love for you to join our email list for that purpose as well. Hope to see you again in December. We do reuse the name tags, so if you'll take those off and leave them on the table, and if you will bust your own stuff, there are trash receptacles in the back. Thank you so much.